Well, hello, everyone. This is Shannan Van Ocampo. I use she and her pronouns, and I serve as the general presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is connecting our conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edge of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Today, we are very excited. We are welcoming the Reverend Dr. Terrlyn Avery, who is the pastor at our Martin Luther King Community Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I'm especially excited about our conversation today about the Poor People's Campaign, as this is a ministry partner to our national Matthew 25 work of the Presbyterian Church USA and a prophetic call to action any person of faith can easily plug into. So we're so glad to have you on the podcast, Reverend Dr. Terrlyn Avery, as you come to connecting the conversations. And I know you are called Rev T at your church, so if that's okay, I'll call you Rev T while we're on this in this podcast space.
Well, actually, there's only
Terrlyn, what would you like?
There's only one person that calls me Rev.
Oh, really? I thought everybody there
Actually,
called you that.
Oh, I know you hear her call that
Because I
name
hear it all the
much.
time.
But I actually prefer Rev or Dr. TLC.
Dr. TLC. All right, fine. We'll do that.
And Terrlyn, of course, Shannan, because we know each other so well, is just perfectly fine as well.
No, names are important. So let's get started with introductions. I know a lot of folks in the Presbytery know you, but maybe not everybody. And I'm hoping that our podcast reaches out beyond the Presbytery. So go ahead and introduce yourself however you would like.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shannan, and thank you for having me on the show. I actually think that one of the things that I always like to share with people that they may not know, I'm actually a fourth generation Presbyterian. So it's steeped in my blood, it's who I am. And yet, being a Presbyterian, I'm also open to all faiths and the ways in which people understand who God is. And so I just want to share that. And I am currently pastoring the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Presbyterian Church in Springfield. I've pastored in other parts of this presbytery and also the Long Island Presbytery as well. And so I'm just delighted to be in this space to talk about such important work as the Poor People's Campaign, which we will talk about in a little bit. But I also have a passion for dismantling racism. And I've done a lot of work on that, and the intersecting the Poor People's Campaign with that work on dismantling racism is really important to me, and I believe important to the work of the Presbytery.
Yeah, it's really, really important to the work. I was listening to Reverend Dr. Barber, one of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign. He actually he has a new book coming out this summer. And so he's on the press, junket for that right now. And he actually was on The Daily Show and interviewed by Jon Stewart last week, which was a fun interview to watch because it got funny, of course, because Jon Stewart, they were hamming it up. And but he was talking about how we think in the United States that poverty, we have the image of an African American woman with children who is, using the system, the welfare queen, that terrible racist image is the image people have of poverty in the United States. And that's not the truth. The truth is that, there are many, many more white people statistically who are poor. And of course, poverty cuts across, every spectrum in the United States, but we racialize it so as to keep people separate, so we can't build power, so we can't work together on these issues. And so we racialize it so then people don't want to, do the work together. And he constantly is making that point. That's not some new point he's making, but he's definitely talking about it again with this book, and certainly, leading up to an election season in the United States. And, we're not officially political in the church, we're 501c3, but we do have a theology around these things, and especially around questions of poverty, which is such a huge issue in the Bible. So.
Well, I think, and that's the whole point of the Poor People's Campaign. And Bishop Barber's conversation around this. This is a moral issue. And part of the thing that's frustrating to me as a pastor, particularly in some spaces,
Mm-hmm.
is that people want to come to church and they want to be comfortable and they don't want to deal with the issues. They don't want to hear what the issues are because they're coming for their souls to be fed in a different way with whatever they're dealing with.
Sure.
But it is a moral issue for us to stand up on
Mhm.
issues of poverty. That's why Jesus said, when I was hungry, you fed me.
Yeah.
When I was naked,
Yeah.
you clothed me. Matthew 25 is a very, very serious mandate for us. And we have to
Mm-hmm.
decide, are we going to be the sheep or the goat in that particular scenario, right?
Right.
When
Right.
Jesus says that I'm going to separate. And for me, I find that we get too comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
where we are to really put our feet to the ground. And since I'm gonna be who I am on this podcast, I'm gonna just
Go
speak
for
directly.
it.
I feel like in affluent churches, and I
Yep.
feel like in churches particularly that are predominantly white churches, at least in my experience, and I have a limited experience in terms of the churches I've pastored, the conversations are very different. So
Yes.
that when I am preaching to my congregation on a Sunday morning, which is predominantly Black, we are talking about what the issues are. Growing up in a Black church, we always talked about what the
Mm-hmm.
issues
Mm-hmm.
were. And I grew up with a white pastor in a
Right.
predominantly Black church
Yeah.
because you have to speak about what is going on. And so that's what I so love about the Poor People's Campaign is that Bishop Barber is saying to us, particularly for those of us who call ourselves pastors,
Mm-hmm.
we have to give a prophetic word. And
Mm-hmm.
if not us, who's going to who's going to
Yeah. Who's going to do that work? And and if you took the Bible, Jim Wallace used to talk about this from Sojourners, and I think I saw him once hold up a Bible that he had somebody do this too, with an X-Acto knife, page by page. But if you took the Bible, the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures, and you took out all the references to economics and to poverty out of it, it looked like, Swiss cheese. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, it is not. It's Matthew 25 is an incredibly important piece of the New Testament for us in the Christian faith, but it is, of course, everywhere. You know this, all over the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets. It is really the fundamental issue in our faith is how do we live as people of God in an economic system that is not of God? How
Right.
do we do that?
And here's the interesting thing, Shannon, because I know that we have to not be political, but in
Right,
many ways, how can we not talk about the politics of poverty?
right.
Right? So as a clergy person, I don't get up in church and tell people who they should vote for, but I
Mhm.
do say that you should vote because voting, there's power in that,
Yes. Yeah.
right? And we at our church will make sure that we register people to vote,
Hmm.
not at
Yes.
the church, but we have programs that, let's say if we have a mission program, we say, are
Hmm.
you registered to vote? And
Right.
we say why your vote matters. And so even if you think about the poor people, right? They're such a big part of the electorate, but they don't understand that, don't believe that, because we as a society have not done enough to
Hmm.
say that your vote matters,
Hmm.
right? For me as a Black woman, of course, I'm going to talk to my Black congregation
Yeah.
about the importance of voting because of what has been done to us historically. And I will often say to them, if our vote didn't matter, why do they try to keep us
Why do
from?
they try to keep us right? Hmm.
So I think that we can use, as I believe some churches do, the excuse of we can't talk politics. But what we can talk about is how do we serve the church
Hmm.
and beyond the church, how do we serve God? And we're
Hmm.
serving God when we give people the right information and when we
Exactly.
charge people who are sitting in church and they're comfortable with the way things are. We have to say, are you living the way of Jesus? If that's who you say you
Mhm.
believe. Now,
Right.
make no mistake about it. The Christian nationalists are talking about
Well, they're
politics.
talking about it every Sunday in their churches.
Exactly. And
Churches.
the thing
Yeah.
that's really important for us is to decide, do we want Christian nationalists saying
Mhm.
who we are, or do
Mhm.
we want to be able to say it? So we can
Right.
play this game of, oh, I'm not going to talk about it.
Right.
But
Well, and for me too, it's also the question of, do we want to be whole people as we are disciples of Jesus Christ? Because if a whole part of our spirituality and our journey of discipleship is bifurcated and can't be talked about, then what kind of journey of discipleship and what kind of faith are we having? You know,
that's right.
everything should be on the table. And there have always been in the history of the church all sorts of these taboo topics that shouldn't be talked about, or we don't talk about that in church, or all sorts of things. And that has always done spiritual harm to people, and not just to people, but to communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, the way I describe Jesus at church when I'm talking to the congregation, I always say the radical revolutionary Jesus. I think it's important to put those adjectives in front of.
Yes.
Jesus was always confronting the
Yes.
powers that be.
Yes.
I think Jesus was quite political, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
and so I think it's just really important for us ultimately to tap into, what does God require of me?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And how do we go to sleep at night? There's a pastor in our presbytery. I will never forget something important that he said one day. We were really talking about racism. You know how at presbytery we break out and we have our conversations. And it was a workshop that was being given, and it was around racism.
Uh,
And he said, I would hate to get to heaven. And God asked me, did I speak a prophetic word around racism
right.
and dealing with what is going on in this country now? Because
Mhm.
this was during a time when every other week you would hear about a Black man being brutalized or shot by.
Right.
And
Right.
when he said that, now I'm a person that dismantles racism, but at the time I was in a white church and I didn't talk a lot about race because I was there to do some healing as their
Mm-hmm.
interim pastor. But his statement, I went back and I preached a sermon to that congregation around race. Now, that didn't mean that I didn't get anybody saying anything to me. I absolutely did.
Yeah.
But his words were powerful. And I hope that he went back and preached a word about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that he said, when I get to heaven, meet my maker,
Mm-hmm.
what's God going to say to me? And
Right.
that's the question that we all have to ask
Mm-hmm.
ourselves.
Yes.
Shannon, I have been in these places. I remember particularly as it related to dismantling racism. I initially was not speaking out as much in the church or community, whatever, because I was focused on the wounds of religion and doing all this. I was still doing my work, but it wasn't like I was publicly, sharing. And my girlfriend also said to me, you are a leader.
Right.
Your voice counts, and you've done this work, so you know
Mm-hmm.
how to do it. I know that focusing on the wounds of religion is what it's about for
Mm-hmm.
you right now, but you have to speak on this because of who you are. And
Mm.
so it helps to have people calling us back to the
Right.
call, to the
And
mission.
reminding us of the calling,
Yes.
so I think we all have times in our ministry where we start to get comfortable, or we start to think something different, and then something jolts us back or helps us remember our calling. And even just going back and rereading the ordination vows we all take is, I think, an important practice,
Yeah.
because they call us to this work very
Mhm.
specifically. But it can be very easy to have situations get you turned around and to forget your calling. I've told the story a few times in sermons close to the anniversary of September 11th that I had only been ordained a few months when that happened, and I was serving a bedroom community of New York City, and so we were, we could we walked to the beach and saw the towers on fire before they went down, and we were that close and lost people, and it was horrible, right? All the things that happened that day. And I was early in my ministry, and I had grown up in a church that had lots of commitments around peacemaking, was very involved in the peacemaking work in Northern Ireland for years. I remember hearing about that all the time as a child. So I was steeped in that work of peacemaking. And that day just sort of broke me and got me thinking that, it would be a good idea to go to war, and it would be a good idea to do these things. And like, I kind of lost my mind for a couple weeks there. And then I was scheduled, before this all happened, I was scheduled to go to a conference in mid-October up at the Stony Point Center. And John Deere was the speaker, who's a Catholic priest, and who's been doing work on peacemaking and nonviolence, mostly on nuclear disarmament for most of his time in ministry. That's been his life's work, which is holy work. And he just ministered to us that weekend. Everybody was very broken. But I feel like that was one of those pivot points where you get kind of turned back around and you're like, wait a second. I was going down a road that would have not have been good for me, would not have been good for the people I'm called to lead, would not have been good for my calling. And, I think God comes at us in those moments and kind of sends us to these places that get us into something different and remind us of actually, like, no, this is who you are. This is why I called you. This is what you're here for. And I always remember that. And I've told John that, since that was a real pivot point. But I like to tell that story, not every year, but occasionally if I'm preaching around 9/11, because I think people can kind of hear that and hear how those events can kind of get us all out of sorts. And you don't have to just be an ordained minister, you just be a person in the pew. We can get all out of sorts with our faith very easily.
Well,
And it's very alluring.
and we can get out of sorts, we can become
Hmm.
complacent, or look, just the busyness of life can get us, focused on something else. I mean, as a pastor, we're dealing with budgets, and we're dealing with the people, and we're dealing with all sorts of things, and we can get caught up in that, because the truth of the matter is, Shannan, and a bit of this already. I am new to the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of things going on with the church in terms of rebuilding. It is unbelievable, the stuff that you have to deal with in just building in general, but in a rebuilding where you've got to deal with everybody, grants and insurance
Yeah.
and all of this. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
There's
It's
no let up.
definitely not something
Hmm.
that Yale Divinity School prepared me for. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
And but in the midst of that, Shannan,
Yeah.
I attend this conference
Right.
on that Bishop Barber, who's now over the Poverty Center at Yale, was offering to people.
Hmm.
And when I attended that, now I'm involved. I'm involved in dismantling racism. I'm really out there. I think
Yeah.
I think that I recently became the interim executive director of the Healing Racism Institute. So it's
Yes.
not, I don't have a
Congratulations,
lot.
Terrlyn.
Well,
Yes.
thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. So it's not like I don't have a lot going on.
Oh, no.
However, when I got there, though, I was reminded of this charge,
Yes.
because I am concerned. I am so terribly concerned about the number of homeless people that are out there,
Yes.
and the fact that there are some places where people don't even make $15 an hour for a living wage.
Hmm.
Is really sad and depressing. And quite frankly, in Connecticut, that's not even enough money that they need to earn in order for them to be able to survive. Because, in quite
No.
frankly, you have to make over $26 an hour to be able to try to survive. And most people are working
Hmm.
even 85 hours a week.
Well, and yeah, and if you're having to work all those hours, right, it starts to add up on you because you get sick because you're
That's
working
right.
too much.
That's right.
You're paying almost everything you're making out for childcare,
That's right.
because you're having to
Absolutely.
work multiple jobs. How can you get an apartment? How can you get a safe place to be? Is there, childcare at the hours that are right for your children? I mean, all the things start
All of those things.
compounding.
That's right.
It's just a bad spiral. And again, it's not a bad spiral because of the person who is poor or low wage. It's a spiral because of capitalism. It's a spiral because of that evil
Absolutely. But
spiral.
most people don't see it that way, because what we
Right.
do is we blame the victims, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And I think the thing is, what attending that conference did for me, it just gave me that charge, and it was helpful to know that there are other ministers and other leaders and other individuals, not just there were scholars that were there were poor people that were there, everybody was there saying this is a problem that we can resolve. And for me, dealing with, the Poor People's Campaign is closely tied to dealing with racism anyway, because it's advocating for equity, in all these areas. So yes, we know that, quite frankly, there are more white people who are in a state of poverty, but if I'm advocating for minimum wage, it's for everybody, right? And I know if life is better for the white people who are in poverty, it's going to be better for the
Hmm.
Black people, the Latin people, the Asian people, all of that. But we also see even just the health disparities that you just mentioned. We
Yes.
know that that exists at a disproportionate rate for people of color, because we're
Hmm.
not given the benefit of the doubt in the same way as white people are when you walk into a hospital. So even
There's a
poor white
compounding
people,
factor. Yeah, that
right? So
everything compounds. Hmm.
exactly. So poor white people definitely have it
Yes.
bad. Poor people, period, have it bad. And so,
Yes.
but then, like you said, is compounded. And so I think the thing for our listeners to understand is that we need to tap into one another's humanity. That
Hmm.
when you see those people out on the street, you see people begging, you see people who can't make it to work, for instance, because they don't have childcare. Those are human beings, those are divine beings, and we all need
Hmm.
to be concerned
Hmm.
about them. And I want to just say to our listeners, because I know we come from a very affluent in our presbytery, it's a
Yes, we are.
presbytery, is I would say look around at the people in your neighborhood, because there are poor people who come into some of these affluent neighborhoods, right? And then there's sections, even in those affluent neighborhoods, where
Hmm.
poor people live. Have you
Yes.
invited those people into your congregation?
Hmm.
Have you figured out a way to help them other than to provide mittens for them during your Christmas, holiday
Right.
gathering? Like what are the real things that you're doing for that community that are not performative? And
And
those questions.
using your power, right?
Exactly.
Because we've got lots of people who are in places where it's not you can make a difference, sure, giving somebody a warm pair of mittens on a cold day in December, no question. But you can also make a lot of difference when you're sitting at a board table,
Yeah,
or when
absolutely.
you're advising someone, or we have
Absolutely.
members of our presbytery who are representatives in Congress,
That's that's
though
right.
that's power. And how do you bring your whole self to that? How do you bring your discipleship self to that?
That's right.
What does Jesus say about who you are in all spaces of your life?
That's right.
Because Jesus didn't say, well, you just do it on one day and you turn it off on another day, right?
That's right. That's right. And you're reminding me, I was just attending a conference actually last week on Juneteenth, that it was a for
Hmm.
Juneteenth celebration. And one of the women said, she used the word love, and we can put power and love all in there together. She
Hmm.
said, if you're doing something in love, it is more than about doing that one thing. It's about changing the policies and the structures and all of
Yes.
that. And
Yes.
you are absolutely right. For the people who are in our presbytery and beyond, who sit in these spaces of power,
Yeah.
really is about saying, how do I change
Mhm.
this system so that others can glean a little bit of what I have, right? Is there a way I can take less? If you're already making millions of dollars on your job, or even less, there are people who will say, I will take less in order to make sure that my
Mhm.
employees have
Yes.
more.
And usually those companies prosper. Yeah.
Absolutely, they do.
Chobani
And
Yogurt is a great example of that, right? The CEO of Chobani Yogurt, an immigrant, he did
yeah,
that, and and now they've been bought out by big group or something. But when he did that, their stock prices went up. Their people prospered. He prospered. It was
but
not
that's
like he
even
lost money.
biblical. But
No, it
Shannon,
wasn't
it's even
difficult.
biblical in the ways that
Yeah,
God
yeah,
blesses us when we trust. and God being our provider for us.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
it just happens for us,
Hmm.
right? On small scales and larger scales as
Yeah.
well.
So tell a little bit about the work with the Poor People's Campaign, what you've gotten involved in right now. And then I know you're headed, and it sounds like a couple other folks are headed from our presbytery later this week. We're recording this on Wednesday, June 26th, but this will probably drop into the podcast space next week. But you all are headed to DC. There's a big mobilization. The work has lots of levels, some of these big mobilization type things, marches in DC, but then it also has a lot of very specific local work. So tell me a little bit about some of that and what that's been like for you as you've gotten involved.
Yeah. And so I just want to first begin by saying, there are people in our presbytery who have been involved in this work much longer than I have. The Reverend Chris Foster, I know, has done this work before, because I could remember her years ago saying, um,
Mm.
I'm going down to this march. And so I know she's been involved. And Rhode Island itself has a contingency, a chapter for the Poor People
Yes.
Campaign. So this is also a plug. Uh, Connecticut
Yes.
does not have a chapter for the Poor People
Yes.
Campaign. And so that might be something that we'll be looking into
Hmm.
soon, because of course they'll be looking for somebody to head that up whenever
Yes.
that happens. But Massachusetts also has a chapter. And so for me, when I went to the conference, and at the time when I went to the conference, my prayer whenever I go into these spaces is, God help me to meet whoever I'm supposed to meet at this conference,
Mm.
that I might be of service and whatever. So
Right.
I ended up meeting the Reverend Dr. Hannah Broom, who is really leading the repairs of the breach. And
Yeah.
we just sort of met and chit-chatted for a few minutes. I briefly, I think, mentioned to her what had happened at MLK in terms of the fire, at MLK. And there was a meeting the very next night in
Mm.
relationship to the Poor People's Campaign. And she said, I'd like you to open up with a few words.
Mm.
And from there, if you are interested in being involved, they will use you. And
Hmm.
I have
Yes.
found myself um, in that space of where she's asked me to be a part of the prayer conference, to lead help do a few words at the virtual rally that they were having.
Hmm.
And anyone who is
Hmm.
interested in being involved, there is a space. And so I felt like during that time, God was moving me and calling me. And it was a spiritual conference, even though it was a policy conference, it was a spiritual one.
Hmm.
And so to answer your question, my involvement has really been around being a voice of prayer, and then also trying to invite people, just really trying to get people to go. I do not have a bus coming from Springfield or mobilize people from there, but there is one coming from Boston, and it's heading down and it's coming through Springfield. So anybody interested can jump on board with that.
Hmm.
And so I have found my involvement to be more along those lines. And I will be at the march in that 90-something degree
Hmm. Hmm.
weather to march and to just be one to lift my voice,
Hmm.
particularly as a clergy person, to say
Yes.
it is important that we change the policies that
Yes.
are connected with feeding people,
Hmm.
sheltering people, providing a
Mm.
just decent living for folks. And so
Yes.
that's what I want to encourage people to
Hmm.
do when they're listening to this podcast after.
Hmm.
I would encourage them to just go and say, how can I be
Yeah.
involved? You can also donate. And so donations are important, but donations are not the only thing that's
Correct.
important.
Well, and for those listening, I think it's important to, hit up the Poor People's Campaign website, which is poorpeoplescampaign.org, really simple, or Google will get you wherever you need to go. But also the Presbyterian Office of Public Witness, which is our advocacy office in Washington, D.C. I think a lot of people don't realize we have an advocacy office in Washington, D.C., and we also have one and a permanent seat at the United Nations. And again, we're not there to do political work, but we are there to do advocacy work based on the mandates of our General Assembly. And
Mhm.
so that Washington office has been working, really hand in glove with the Poor People's Campaign, from day one, once we got Matthew 25 through the General Assembly as a mandate for the whole church, that then gave us the room and the ability to join up and join forces with the Poor People's Campaign. And there's all sorts of things the Washington office is advocating on right now. That one of the main pushes nationally they're working on right now is the U.S. Farm Bill. And you might not think the Farm Bill is that important when we live in these very urban places like the Northeast, but our presbytery runs between New York City and Boston, and we don't think about farms a lot in our presbytery, but the Farm Bill is an incredibly important and powerful and trillion-dollar piece of legislation that controls almost all of the food policy in the United
Right.
States. And so
Right.
important. And so there's stuff up there on that about it. And, all the way down to even just local state laws, about how, a lunch program is implemented in a school, or zoning laws about, where grocery stores are allowed to be, or, food stamp access. It really is, in so many ways, the issues of poverty, soup to nuts, and there's just an entry point for everyone based on what you're interested in. Um,
Right.
I think
Right.
that's
And
a really important piece to sort of underscore that it's a big issue, but it's also an issue that's really easy to plug into because there's
and
so
I
many
think
entry points.
I think what's important about what you're saying about that is that get get involved means to be informed, because
Right.
we form a lot of opinions about who we believe
Hmm.
where people are because we don't have enough information. Oh, they could work if they wanted to work. They could do
Hmm.
better if they wanted. Well, I don't understand why you aren't paying your
Hmm.
bills. Some of this is just the basic thing of understanding, like you
Yes.
said, about food and how it
Right.
gets to our tables. Somebody has to help get that food to our tables. And those very people who are often working in those in the laborers, they're getting
Yes.
food on our tables because we can afford to buy it, but then they may be suffering themselves. And
They're
so I
suffering
think
deeply.
that what
Yes.
you're really saying to people is
Yes.
first get involved by understanding.
Hmm.
Let there be another perspective, right?
Right.
Come out of our own towers to say, what is life like for
Right.
the people, right?
Right.
And I just want to say this too. This is sort of an aside. The Reverend Liz Theo Harris is Presbyterian, and she's the co-leader with
Yep.
Bishop
Liz is
Harper. And I
fabulous.
think it's important for us because we don't always hear her name,
Right.
and I
Right.
think it's important for us to know that this work takes a group of people doing
Hmm.
the work. And so I always say to people, maybe you can't get out there and march with us. It may be too hot for you to get out there and
Sure.
do it because of health reasons. Maybe you can't travel, but there is something that you can do.
Hmm.
There are always phone calls to be made. There are
Hmm.
ways that you can call and say, what can I do? Each of us are a part of the body of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And a little toe can't say, I don't want to be a part of this body anymore. What
Hmm.
happens when we break our little toe or stub it? You realize how important it is,
Oh,
right?
I know that story very well in my own life because I
I
did break my
know,
little toe.
know. And so I just want to say that
Yeah.
there really is no
Yeah.
excuse for being involved
Exactly.
in the work of social justice uh, on any level. And there's always an intersectionality
There
that
absolutely is. And we'll put in the show notes and in the link on social media, Liz Theo Harris, who's at the Cairo Center, which is part of Union Seminary in the city. Um, Liz is co-chair and a Presbyterian minister, but she's written a great book, Blessed Are the Poor, question mark,
Mhm.
which I really think everyone should read because she reframes our theology around that in a really helpful way. But Liz also was a keynoter this past January at the Matthew 25 Summit for the Presbyterian Church USA. There were 4 keynoters, and We'll put a link to that YouTube of her keynote, because she goes right into it, and she goes into it biblically, theologically, socially, politically, who we are as a church, who are we as Presbyterians. She really goes into it. And the other story I wanted to share on this about the Poor People's Campaign is that before I came to Southern New England in 2017 as your general presbyter, I was in Albany for 3.5 years, Presbytery, which is in upstate New York, but it's a capital city. So the Presbytery Presbytery is 14 counties. They're, all around the capital. And the Poor People's Campaign is a national movement. They have organizers in all 50 states. Some, as you've said, are less involved than others. But New York and North Carolina are the two best organized states in the movement. And Liz is from New York, and Bishop Barber is from North Carolina. So no surprise, right? And also, New York is a huge economy, right? New York and California are two biggest economies in the United States, some of the biggest economies in the world. And so I got immediately thrust into this work in my first month in Albany, because the whole presbytery was working on it, and a lot of our local pastors were working on it. And we have churches that are literally like First Hartford and our presbytery in Connecticut, across the street from the State House. And so those churches would open up their fellowship hall to be used for staging grounds for all sorts of events, and open their bathrooms during marches and all these sorts of things. So very, very involved. The thing that there was lots of work the Poor People's Campaign did while I was there that I was really lucky enough to be involved in and continues to do. But the thing that was most meaningful to me was they went out with a group called the Labor Religion Coalition, who they partnered with in New York State, which is a coalition of labor leaders and religious leaders, interfaith religious leaders across the state, to build power. And they went out to about a dozen counties around New York State. And, everybody thinks of just, the 5 boroughs down in the city, or maybe Niagara Falls or something, right? But they went to some of the places no one goes to. They went to the Shinnecock Nation on Long Island, and listened to the indigenous community. And they went to poor farming communities and listened to undocumented farm workers. And what they did in each of these communities was they held public hearings, and they were held over a series of a couple days, and anyone could come and provide their testimony on how poverty was affecting them in their individual personal life and what was happening. And then they had a gathering in Albany. It was at a Methodist church, and they played some of them, and they're all cataloged. They're all on the internet. You can find them and see hundreds of hours of testimony. And they played the testimony. I heard testimony. 2 women came who were both social workers, women with master's degrees, educated, all this stuff. And they came and they talked about how impossible it is to do their job, how traumatized they are by trying to do their job serving poor people and low-wage people, and how everything is stacked against them and they cannot do their job. And they wanted to just put that on the record. And then there was a family that came and talked about how medical debt just crushed their family and what it did to them. And then there were immigrant families and indigenous families, and all sorts of people came and provided testimony. And then they've been using that testimony in a really provocative way from a communication standpoint, bringing it to legislators and saying, look at what's going on around our state, this wealthy, wealthy state.
Yeah.
What is happening here? What is wrong about this? And what are the through lines of all of it? And that was some really deep organizing work. And it gave everybody an opportunity to plug in, because it gave the undocumented worker an opportunity to come and tell their story and tell their truth. And then it also gave these women, they make a salary, they own their homes, but they're social workers, and they said they go home every day and they cry in the car.
Yeah.
Because they can't do their work, right? And so, they had a spectrum, and how this really affects people. So I hope that storytelling work, that work of listening to communities, that's such an important part of this movement. But that's also Jesus' work, right? Jesus was always giving people a voice.
Right. And Shannan, I think the thing that's important, even as you're talking about this, is that um, you know, the Poor People's Campaign isn't only just about poor people. Um, in terms of people not making a living wage. And I think it's really important to say this, because even those social workers who
Mm-hmm.
go home, they may not have even be able to have affordable housing. You see,
Right.
so the campaign itself is really much
Mm-hmm.
harder. There are people who might be considered making a decent wage,
Sure.
but then what about appropriate housing? And that's what I
Mm-hmm.
love about the Poor People's Campaign, is that it's this opportunity to stretch wider and
Yes.
broader than we think. It even looks at things like, gun violence, voter
Yes.
suppression. It looks at all of those things. And that's what the testimonies will do for us,
Mm-hmm.
is that
Mm-hmm.
it helps people to say, wait a minute, you go to church with me, but yet
Mm-hmm.
you're going home and you're having this issue over here that I don't
Yes.
even know about, because maybe I make $500,000 and you make
Mm-hmm.
$100,000, or
Right.
now of course that sounds very affluent to even say
Mm.
that, but I'm just thinking about our
Sure.
Presbyterian, right?
Yeah.
And so what are people struggling with? And those
Mm-hmm.
stories are really important. So I want to encourage the listeners, go and find the information that Shannan is talking about. But if you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, you will hear people tell
Mm-hmm.
their stories, particularly Shannan, and we can all kind of relate to this, healthcare and
Yes.
medical care. There are people who work in the healthcare industry, but those companies may not
Mm-hmm.
provide good healthcare for them.
Right.
So they
Right.
talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have to be concerned
Yeah.
about these issues. And
Absolutely.
so I just want to encourage people to do their research, to get
Mm-hmm.
involved, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to encourage people to pray. But here's what
Yes.
the thing is about prayer, because faith without works is dead. Prayer is the thing that changes the prayer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about changing our hearts and our minds. So when we're out here praying for the poor, the prayer ought to be, God, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
Change my heart to
Change
help me
me.
see, because,
Yes.
you know, and also I want to say this because I know we're going to be running out of time here soon. Bishop Barber and the Reverend Theo Harris both need to be in our prayers.
Absolutely.
I say that because this is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
This is sacrificial work for all of us. I know
Mm-hmm.
the things that I've had to sacrifice doing the work that I do. And so
Yeah.
I know that it is costing them a
Yes.
lot to do this work. And so I just want to put in a plug to pray for them. And I also know, I don't know about the Reverend Theo Harris, but I know Bishop Barber gets death threats.
Oh, they
So,
both do. Yes. Mm-hmm.
so this is very serious
Very
work.
serious work.
And
Yes.
and for people to say, I'm going to do this anyway,
Yes.
we owe them,
Mm-hmm.
because our lives are made better because of the people who have sacrificed
Mm-hmm.
in ways in which we haven't sacrificed.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to make sure that I get that plug in.
No, it's very important. It's very important. And, and it's also important as we talk about this storytelling piece, it helps us again, we started the podcast conversation here about sort of the quick hit on the stats of poverty, that we think, everybody who's poor is Black or something like this. And we, the way that it's set up is to get us into this silo mentality so we don't care. But that's the other thing about these stories, is help us realize, like, it's so intersectional, and it interacts with everything else, right? The issues of poverty, they interact with issues of the climate crisis. They interact with issues of militarism. They
That's right.
interact with issues of the exploitation of women and girls. They interact with the issues of colonialism and the exploitation of Indigenous people that's still going on today, and on and on and on. These are intersectional things, and this is why, Jesus talked about the powers and the principalities, and that's what we're talking about. And Jesus, we don't like to talk in the Presbyterian Church too much about evil. We don't have a good theology of evil, I don't think, sometimes, and I think we should have a better one, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a
Yeah,
power, a principality. We're dealing with an evil that has its own force, but that is ultimately not of God and not
right,
where God would have us be. And so what is our role, right?
right.
Who are we to
But
be?
I want to just say something, Dr. Shannan, by the way,
Uh,
because I want to go back to something that you just said when you're talking about the intersectionality. You know, the Poor People's Campaign is concerned about environmental justice, clean
Absolutely.
air, clean water. And I remember, being a part of your study, how when we came together as pastors, there were things around environmental racism, even
Hmm. Hmm.
that folks were not aware of. And this is why we have to get out and be involved and do
Yes.
our homework, right?
Yeah.
Because we can't get up and preach a gospel
Mm.
without understanding these things. And so when we talk about the intersectionality of this Poor People's Campaign, is dealing with so many issues that impact us all, that we
Right.
all need to be concerned about. So
Yeah. Well,
um,
thank you, Terrlyn. This has been great. We could keep going and going as usual, you and I talking about things, but this has been so helpful. I want to just say deep blessings to you and Reverend Chris Foster from our presbytery and anyone else who's headed to DC this weekend. And deep peace, deep safety, deep power to all of you as you go. And I also hope we'll do a part two and hear, some of what happened and things we can
yes,
be thinking about. This is a huge issue as we head into the fall season. We didn't even get a chance to talk about Christian nationalism, and that's another thing we've absolutely got to talk about. So we
yes,
should definitely do a part two and talk about Christian nationalism because that is so, so important, the misusing of our faith in the United States and around the world
yeah,
today.
yeah,
So we
yeah.
definitely want to do a part two at some point this summer. So thank you. Thank you, Terrlyn, Reverend TLC, for being on our podcast. We're so grateful for you, for your ministry. We are always praying for you, and especially for the MLK congregation during this time of rebuilding, because this is such an important but also a very tender time. And
Yeah.
so we are always praying. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
Thank you.
being with us. Thank you for your ministry, and thank you for being part of our Connecting the Conversations and
You're
this
welcome. Thanks
podcast.
for having me. Thanks.